Storytellers, an evening with the authors of History Through Fiction's member area. So I'm really glad that you could join us for this special event. If you've seen some of the events we've had before, I have a panel called "What's New in Historical Fiction," where I interview or do authors that have new historical fiction books coming out. So this is going to be a little bit different because we have our short story authors and one novel excerpt from these independent authors that have submitted their work to History Through Fiction, and their work has then been published into our just launched member area. So if you are not familiar with that, I hope you get a chance to check it out. There's actually a green button there on the bottom of the screen where you can go to join the member area and read these fantastic stories. I'm Colin Mustful. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction. We are a small independent press that focuses on historical fiction. Before I bring on our panelists, I am just going to go over the features here of Crowdcast. Now, just a fair warning, this is actually a new updated version of Crowdcast, and they're beta testing it right now. So they have some more features that the original version of Crowdcast doesn't have, but it is essentially the same. So if you look on the right side of your screen, you see a chat feature, and you can communicate with anyone. You can make comments there and just say hello. In fact, I'd appreciate that if you just want to say, "Hey, I'm checking in from wherever you're coming to us from." There's also right below the chat, if you look on the very right side, is a Q&A, and you can see a little chat box with a question mark. If you have questions for our panelists, please post those in the Q&A, and then I'm going to ask the panelists those questions once we near the end of the event. And also, people can go on and vote. So you can look at the Q&A, and if you like one of the questions, go ahead and upvote it, and then that'll let me know what questions I should prioritize. There's a button for polls there. I didn't put in any poll questions today. You can also look at the list of people. And as I have already mentioned, there is a green button on the bottom that says join the member area. So if you want access to these stories, you can click on that at any time during the event, and that'll take you to our member area with History Through Fiction. So without further ado, I'm going to bring the panelists on, and we're going to start the event. Okay, well, let's start with we have Bex Lang, or Bex Roden, I'm sorry. She's got a pen name, and that's what she published under. So, Bex, why don't you tell us a little about yourself, and if you could read an excerpt for us as well.
Yes. Hi. Good evening. I'm Bex Rodden, but Bex Lang, whatever. My name is Rebecca, but I go by Bex sometimes. So I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and active duty military and writing in my free time, hoping to be a novelist someday. So this is an excerpt from my story. It's called The Finishing. My God. Oh my goodness, Lord. What could this mean? Pamela brought frantic hands to her head as she rushed to the mirror to pin up her hair, blink the sadness out of her eyes, and straighten her dress once again. Her fingers and limbs trembled as she worked. He never summons the girls, never. She breathed heavily, and she fought ideas of what awaited her behind those towering doors. Then she scurried out of her chamber, maneuvering herself carefully as she hastened through Papillon's hall in the direction of Mr. Egerton's office. When she reached the threshold, she positioned herself 3 paces from the doorway, her toes just touching the perfect line drawn in charcoal across the floor. She breathed deeply several times to steady herself, then patted her gray skirts so that they fell naturally about her ankles without any kinks or protrusions. She looked at the clock mounted on the wall directly adjacent to the office doors. 1 minute to spare. You horrible wretch, she thought. How could you be so careless, arriving with such a small margin on such an occasion? And she pinched her eyes shut as tight as she could as a way of punishing herself. But just then she heard movement from behind the doors, and after a moment Mr. Egerton's voice called out firmly, "Enter." Pamela's breath caught, and her nerves congealed until they formed what felt like a cannonball in her stomach. But she did not show it. In fact, looking upon her from the outside, one would think she appeared the most content and cheerful young lady there had ever been. She let out her breath slowly as she marched 3 paces to the door and opened it wide enough for her petite body to slip silently through. Then she stood still as it shut behind her, cleared her throat, and spoke with the perfect mixture of deference and grace. "Mr. Egerton, sir, you wanted to see me?" She looked at him as she spoke, at his deep-set black eyes gleaming in the lamplight. He smiled a slight, genteel smile that should have quelled her fears. She was sure it was intended to, but there was something in his expression that discomforted her, that made it seem like the wintry weather out of doors had somehow managed to come in and settle itself around her neck and drape its tail down her spine. Something about his eyes, inanimate like the beads on a doll's face, or perhaps it was the way his white hair curled in long, gangly sweeps across his forehead and down his neck. What is it? But she brushed the feeling away and recovered herself, smiling back at him. Nothing. It's nothing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bex. And just a little behind the scenes. So that story Bex published on her own website before submitting it to us. Well, she didn't really submit it to us. She said, "Hey, I've got all this great work," and so I went and looked at her website and I read the story and I loved it. But she and I kind of worked on just putting some finishing touches on it before we finally published it here to History Through Fiction. And it was really nice to hear you read it in your voice because I read it a dozen times and only in my own head. So that was really nice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next, we have Lori Dillman, author of To Free a Panther. Lori, why don't you tell us about yourself and read an excerpt for us?
There we go. Thank you. So, Lori Dillman here. I write under the name L.H. Dillman, and I'm mainly a crime writer. This novel excerpt that I'm going to read from has to do with the Black Panther Party and the FBI and the wrongful conviction of a Black Panther for murder. He ends up in prison for 35 years. And I sent in an excerpt that was set in the year 1970, which I think qualifies as historical. So that's what I'm reading today, one of the chapters set in 1970. And this picks up where a rising star in the Black Panther Party is talking to a bunch of rich white liberals from whom he hopes to raise a bunch of money. Johnny went to the Steinway, shook her hand, and turned to the guests. His dark eyes took in the sea of white faces. For the first time, he felt nervous, and instinctively he assumed the posture, arms folded across his chest, stance wide, chin jutting. How many of you think you understand the Black Panthers? If you've heard we aim to overthrow a racist system that continues to oppress our people 100 years after the official end of slavery, that's right. But if you've heard that we are racist ourselves, that we have something against white people, that's wrong. What we're opposed to is the white power structure. He realized that he could be coming across as hostile, so he loosened his limbs and erased the scowl on his face. The corporate media and their cronies in government tell you we're no better than criminals, but you can't believe them. They're the same people telling you we're winning the Vietnam War. Cassie's brother slipped out, off to do his homework or smoke a joint. Where do they get off calling us criminals? Johnny demanded. I ask you, is it criminal to feed children who are hungry? He held up one finger. That's what the Black Panthers are doing. We're feeding 200 kids every day out of one center in Oakland, and we aim to expand. The paisley shirt guy said, right on. I ask you, Johnny held up a second finger, is it criminal to give families transportation so they can visit their men in prison where they don't belong? Cassie began to clap. Someone joined in. And let me ask you, he raised a third finger, is it criminal to set up free health clinics and test for sickle cell anemia? And vaccinate the kids? The Panthers are doing it here and in Detroit and LA and Chicago. Applause filled the room. Such was the power of the rule of three, as an oratorical device Johnny had copied from Martin Luther King Jr., rest his soul. You could call Martin meek and deferential, and the Panthers did, but that man sure knew how to give a speech. Johnny allowed himself a half smile. No, we are not the criminals, he said. The criminals are the cops and the politicians and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The audience hissed and booed. The Rampart's editor took out his pen and notepad. They've got spies everywhere, Johnny said. They're opening our mail, tapping our phones. They're agents of repression. Fascists, yelled the guy in Roman sandals. More booze and hisses. They're primed for the pitch. Well, brothers and sisters, the Black Panthers party needs your help. Wait, Mr. Wade. The speaker was the chairman of the opera, Michael Cacciati, an obese man with a ruddy face whose name Johnny remembered as Cacciatore, like the chicken dish. What about the Panthers' 10-point program? Asked the opera chairman. That's all for today.
Thank you, Lori. And I'll let the audience know this too. I've had a chance to read Lori's entire manuscript, and it's fantastic, and it raises some really important issues and brings up some really important questions. Next, let's bring on Harrison Voss. Harrison is the author of This Banquet of Blood. Harrison, if you could introduce yourself and read a little excerpt for us.
Hey everyone, good evening. My name is Harrison. I'm from Connecticut, and I work in finance, but on the side, I'm also a writer. And in college, actually, I studied ancient history, so a lot of my historical fiction, including this story, is set in the ancient Mediterranean world. When I spotted the slave boy Gello pacing my dwelling's forecourt, I knew my lover was dead. I'd spent the morning on the track running circuits, a handful of boys wandering late and whispering of a battle in the north. I thought this only gossip until I returned home and spotted Gello's narrow shoulders, his eyes struggling to meet mine. Alexius has fallen, he confirmed. I collapsed without a sound right there in the forecourt, Gello drawing me inside for some shade and water. We were at war. The sacrilegious Phocians had seized the sun god Apollo's sanctuary at Delphi and plowed its hallowed fields, spurring seven-gated Thebes to march against them and enact divine vengeance. Clear-eyed Alexius was a member of the city's premier sacred band, and Gello, one of the army's errand boys. He'd witnessed from the band's baggage train the battle that swallowed my lover whole. Alexius was stationed in the phalanx's second line beside Pelopidas, his own lover from an earlier life. Years fled, but their ardor remained, even as Pelopidas turned a father and a husband, and Alexius my own bedside companion. They warred beside one another, Eros their shield, and whenever the fates declared that Alexius should perish, or elect to retire from the band, then my turn would come, and I'd take my place in the phalanx at his side. Or so it was to be, before fortune played her fickle hand. One of the band's front linesmen, distressed and broke formation, moments before the armies clashed. The Phocians poured through the breach and swept our ranks, an enemy spear lopping my lover's head like a poppy in the breeze of fall planting. Pelopidas fought over the remains for Portogello, until the enemy threw him down too, and bowsprit sank to Hades' halls below. I envisioned Alexius' slack limbs sliding to the mud, his ashen lips drowned in a field of blood and viscera. Tears sprang down my cheeks. He was a man like your mind to me that I knew one could be, a man I believed could grapple gore-hungry Ares and reign supreme.
Thank you, Harrison. Yeah, Harrison's story is just fantastic. It's about soldiers. It's got violence, but it's not about that violence. It's very emotional, and it kind of gives you all the feels. Finally, let's bring on Ken Davis, the author of Six Faces of War. Ken, if you could introduce yourself and read a little bit from your story.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ken Davis. I was a teacher most of my life. When I was in college, I was an ROTC cadet, and in the process of learning about the Army, I learned a lot of things about Vietnam through my instructors and my friends. So my story is about, it's a fictionalized person, but it's based on actual events. What I'm going to read is a letter from my chapter, my fourth part of the story, which I call Chapter 4 Letters. And this is a letter from the male character to his fiance. Saturday, 15 July, 1967. Darling, I was sort of disappointed when I didn't get any mail today. That's 3 days now, and honey, I'm getting anxious to hear from you again. I have a radio here in my bunker that can pick up the Da Nang base transmission, I was wondering what the hit parade is playing these days back in America. Are they still playing Happy Together and Groovin'? What do you think of Can't Take My Eyes Off of You? I guess time is moving rather slowly for you now, isn't it, honey? I hope you keep busy with things until school picks up again. I know how your mind gets to wondering when you have so much time to yourself. I have that little picture that you had taken at school with the velvet jacket. I always get it when I start writing you. Honey, would there be a chance of you getting that picture enlarged and sending it to me? I think that's the best picture you ever gave me. Just in case anything happens to me, Anne, I think it would be a good idea for you to get rid of the ring and the things by pawning them. I would suggest you get rid of everything concerning me. You can't live on memories, you know, and I wouldn't want you doing that. Of course, I'm going to do my best to see that nothing happens to me, honey. But now you know how I feel. Maybe we'd better talk of things more pleasant. I noticed a big cathedral in town the other day when I flew back to base for a conference. It had peonies planted along the whole side of the building facing a side street, just like the ones I picked for you at the diner. They remind me so much of you. I often think of the nights we used to walk home from church together at Indiana. I used to live just for those Sunday nights so I could walk back to the dorm with you and put my arm around you for a few seconds before driving back to Penn State. When I stop to think of how we managed then for quite a long time, surely we can stand it a little longer, darling. For now, we know that we belong to each other, and then we can only hope, and our hopes, even as dim as they were, come true. I love you so much. With all my love, Joe.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, it's really lovely story, but honestly, it's very sad. But I know that's very, very real what soldiers have to go through. So I'm going to proceed now by just doing a little round robin of asking each of the panelists some questions. Remember, if you have a question for any of our panelists, just click on that Q&A and type it in there, and we'll get to that later. So Bex, I want to start with you. I don't know if I told you this, but so your story takes place at Papillon Hall. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but
Papillon.
Papillon, which is French for butterfly. Is that right?
It is,
Okay,
yes.
I didn't know that. And then I looked
Okay.
at Papillon Hall on Wikipedia, and it's shaped like a butterfly. So I didn't know any of this when I was your story has a whole butterfly theme, and I didn't know. So I feel kind of silly about that.
Oh no! Oh my goodness! Not at all.
Can you talk? Well, what is Papillon Hall, and why did you decide to write a story that takes place there?
Yes. Okay. So papillon means butterfly in French, and actually, it's funny. It's a metaphor that I didn't really come up with. It kind of came to me in a sense. The story is based on a nightmare that I had. It's kind of a gothic, grotesque story, and scary in some places. But I had a nightmare about the character Mr. Egerton, and at the climax of the story, the character. Well, to preface a little bit more, it's a finishing school that helps young women become as perfect as they can possibly be. So the protagonist is a girl who attends this finishing school and just tries her hardest to be the best individual that she could possibly be. And so in my nightmare, there was a man who ran this conservatory, and there were butterflies hanging all over the place, and girls in cute little tutus that were just trying to please him, and to just be as perfect as they can. And at one point, I went into his office. This is my nightmare, and was admiring the butterflies on the wall. And then all of a sudden, he turned around and was this monster with a big club, and he just. So, anyways, you'll have to read the story a little bit, but it turns quite scary toward the end. But the reason why I wrote this and wanted to pull these ideas in together is because the story is about religious abuse and emotional and spiritual abuse, primarily. And it's about a young woman who is trying her hardest to be as virtuous, as good as she can possibly be. And there was this idea at the time, it's set in 1871, which was the Victorian era. There was an idea at the time that women's virtue and morality could actually save men. So the men didn't necessarily have to be virtuous and moral, but the women, their morality could ultimately, if the man just thinks about this woman, then he can also become moral. So, anyways, there's a lot of Victorian ideology in this, a lot of evangelical, very legalistic ideology in the story. And so that's kind of a little bit of backstory of why I decided to write that. But when you think about it, a butterfly is very delicate, perfect creature. And it goes from being a cute little caterpillar that's kind of an ugly creature, you could say, to being something that's almost the epitome of perfection. And so I found that metaphor to be actually quite profound. And my story is a bit of a satirical, grotesque reversal of an actual butterfly transforming into something beautiful, whereas my character transforms into something perhaps not so beautiful at the end. So, anyways, just a little back on that.
Yeah, so there's kind of a lot of hidden themes in there, and sorry about your nightmare. That sounds awful.
I know. Yeah.
Well, Lori, let's go to you. Now you have a background as a lawyer, so can you talk about why you decided to write this main character that you have as a lawyer who's trying to free a wrongly convicted Black Panther?
Sure. Well, I think I've had the germ for this story in my mind for maybe decades, way before I ever practiced law or went to law school. And that was that when I was an adolescent hiking in the Point Reyes National Seashore, I apparently was right near the murder of a forest ranger. And later that day was interviewed by FBI agents. And that made this huge impression I could never forget, especially since the interview took place after my chums and I were leaving this A-frame where there were about 150 marijuana plants growing upside down, hanging to dry. And everybody thought that this was going to be, this was going to be it for all of us teenagers. So I couldn't get the story out of my head. And I followed up to find out whatever happened with that murdered park ranger. And it turned out that a Black Panther had been convicted of the crime. And so this is in the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 1970s. Right in actual fact, when the Black Panthers were starting to be of less significance in America, and they were sort of on their way out. But in any event, I decided this has got to be the germ of a good story. And it turned out that this guy who's been sitting in prison for 35 years, as of this present day in my story, he had the opportunity to seek parole, because parole was at that time, for a very brief window in America, available to federal prisoners. And he never wanted it, because in order to get paroled, you have to express remorse. And he kept saying, I never did it. I was framed. And I thought, well, that's interesting. The guy would rather spend the rest of his life in jail. And so I decided to spin a tale. And the tale that I wanted to tell was not just about the Panthers and their demise at the hands of pretty much the FBI, and also partly themselves, but also as a lawyer, I wanted to show how difficult it actually is in the federal system, especially to get somebody who's innocent out of prison, because it's all about procedure, not innocence. And I don't think most people understood that, and I wanted to display that in a fictional form.
That's really just an incredible. I mean, the true part of it is pretty incredible. But that's so great the way you're able to bring it to life and help others learn about it who might not have a background in all the legal aspects of it. Let's go to Harrison. So Harrison, you have a story set in ancient Greece. How were you able to recreate the setting and the way they talked and just everything, all the historical elements of the story?
Yeah. For any story, I will always go to the primary sources. But in this case, or this particular story, the setting, 4th century BC Thebes, so it's not like a big city like Athens or Sparta. There isn't that much that we have really regarding what was going on then. I mean, we had like some other sources written from people in other cities, but really the best sources we have are from hundreds of years later. So what I really did for recreating the environment was rely more so, I would say, on like scholarly sources than I normally would for this story. Like James Rom's book on the Sacred Band, Park Cartledge's book on Thebes, Richard Billow's book on Philip of Macedon, who was Alexander the Great's father and the primary antagonist of this story. So yeah, really just working with kind of esteemed classicists, how they were able to build off of more epigraphic, so like smaller literary evidence that I couldn't really find, and archaeological evidence primarily, and really I worked with their reconstructions more so. And as for the dialogue, that was more just from like my years of reading lyrical Greek poetry, epic Greek poetry, and just trying to think how in English, and also just like looking at how it's usually translated into English, trying to go with that vibe as well. So try to give it like kind of a stately talk, but also keep it a little, not too stilted, hopefully.
Did you have to go through a lot of drafts to arrive at what you finally have?
I did, yes. And I worked, so the first few drafts were mostly just with those few primary sources I had mentioned earlier. And so for the second and third drafts, I worked with the scholarly sources, and I learned like there were whole figures or characters, I guess, in this case, that I learned about that I was like, oh, I have to throw them in here, or even just like little bits about the city, and how it's very deeply, Thebes is a very rich city when it comes to Greek myth. So very famous heroes like Hercules and Oedipus are all from Thebes. So there's a very big it's a very important cultural center. And so I wanted to kind of allude to that as much as possible in the story itself.
That's great. I think you got in a lot of that, and it doesn't come off as forced or anything like you're trying to force that information on us. It just flows naturally. Ken, let's go to you. So in your story, you have a soldier going off to Vietnam. How much of your own experience did you put into that story?
Well, when I was in college, like I said, I was in ROTC, and I was a good shot with a rifle. I was put on the rifle team, and then my junior year, I was qualified for the Ranger group of training for ROTC cadets, and I did very well on that. In fact, I was one of 3 guys that won an orientation. It's called orienteering, which using a compass. Nobody uses that anymore, but using a compass to find your way through mountains or whatever. And of course, I had a lot of friends. All my friends were in ROTC. I eventually got a medical discharge. I have asthma. I didn't think it was a problem, but right before I was commissioned, they said it would be a problem if I was in Vietnam. So I never got to go, but my friends did. 3 of them were killed. The one that I used as my main character was one that I knew well. And what I tried to do was use his experiences that I had with him, and of course, stories that my instructors, who all had been in Vietnam, stories that they told me when we were lying in under blankets, in the cold or whatever on training duties. And so I just tried to put all of these things together and make a story out of it that I thought showed how people who are actually in the military and their families, how they can be affected by warfare, where somebody actually dies, and how that affects not just the family, but everybody that's associated with that person.
Yeah, definitely ripple effects there, and thank you so much for sharing that in your story and for your service. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, let's go back to Bex. Bex recently published a guest blog post on historythroughfiction.com. It's about the history of historical fiction. Bex has a knack for literary analysis and some more of the academic side of literature. So I'm curious. First, does it make it a little harder for you to write fiction with this background in literary analysis? And on the other hand, does it help you become a better storyteller by being able to pick apart some of this classic literature?
Yeah. So just for some context, I have a bachelor's and a master's in English literature. And I would say in response to that question, it helps and it also doesn't help. And I'll just answer that briefly and expound on that. It helps because I am able to add to conversations that can be centuries old. You know, the humanity at large has been asking questions, and what does it mean to be human? And the question that I particularly address in my story is the woman question, which was a very prominent discourse that was going on in the Victorian era in England and the United States and other Western countries, which was, what is woman's proper role in society? And I'm able to recognize, like, say, Chaucer's Wife of Bath, the Wife of Bath's tale from his Canterbury Tales, written in 1341, something like that, if I remember that correctly. But that was questioning women's roles even way back in the Middle Ages. And my story specifically, the protagonist, Pamela Andre, is a reference to Samuel Richardson's novel, which was published in 1730, Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. It was one of the very first novels, actually, ever to be considered a novel. It was one of the first of the genre. And it was about a young girl saying similar thing, just very perfect. And the subtitle of this novel is Virtue Rewarded. And so it's just this question of what does it mean to be a virtuous woman, and how can that be rewarded? What is virtue rewarded? So, anyways, it's a conversation that's been going on for centuries, and I'm able to recognize that through various works of literature that I've studied. And I think that anybody who loves reading can kind of recognize that and add on to it. So, in that sense, I think maybe it helps, maybe perhaps just in my mind or in others, but in a different sense, it doesn't help so much because literary analysis is so different than creative writing, and you use big academic words as opposed to just words that actually meet the heart of other people who are reading a story that doesn't need to be big and heady. And it's been hard for me to pull my head out of that arena and into a more imaginative world, because it is very different. But I'm working on it, and I think I've got a good foundation. Hopefully, I can step more into the imaginative world. So that's my response.
Well, I think that's great what you mentioned, that by studying, by all of us studying history, we can see the connectedness to where the conversation is today. It's not just something that happened, but it's ongoing. Let's go to Lori again. Lori, I'm curious, kind of the same question I asked Bex is, so you have this legal background that's a lot drier form of writing. Does that make it harder for you to write fiction? Does it help in some other ways?
I would say it makes it harder. I'd say it's something I had to overcome, and I still stumble for sure. Because as a litigator or a trial lawyer, you're trying to persuade, and you've got to be clear, and you've got to be logical, and nobody in the courtroom other than the jury maybe is afraid of those $10 words, whereas what you all do and what I hopefully do is really entertain and appeal to emotion, and to do that is a completely different skill, and that's not something I appreciated when I set out on this venture. I mean, yeah, you can give lip service to that, but I'm definitely a left brain person, and it's really hard to make that shift, especially with the legal background, I think.
And can you talk a little bit about how you are able to use your knowledge to insert that into your fiction, make it more authentic?
Well, I clerked for a federal judge. I'm familiar with how federal courts work. My husband's a trial lawyer. If I need a question answered about, when would the court reporter read it back, or what would the judge do? That's not an issue. I think, as a matter of fact, I play out the courtroom scenes in my head, and I probably go overboard, and I need people like you, Colin, to cut it short. But no, it's clearly, obviously helpful. I set out thinking, oh, I'll be John Grisham, 30 years later and as a woman, but turns out that it's not that easy.
So this question just kind of popped in my head. I don't watch many courtroom dramas. I don't know if you do. Are you irritated if you watch any of them?
Yes, I mean, I think that actually some TV shows and even some books, novels, do a disservice to the public because they portray things that they're so not likely to happen, and they'll do it for dramatic purposes, and maybe it suits that 30 minutes, but the average person comes away with it thinking that's how it really is. And I think it actually gives people lowers their respect for the institutions of justice, which I personally think is a problem. I don't like what I see on TV. I don't watch them.
Well, yeah, it makes for some good entertainment, I guess.
Yeah.
Harrison, so I'm curious about your characters. The soldiers in your story develop quite a bond, and they're also this warrior lifestyle that it seems like 24/7 is that's just their job. Um, how historically accurate was that? What was the camaraderie like for soldiers in ancient Greece?
Yeah. It was very different depending on each city. And the Sacred Babe of Thebes, which is the army that I focus on this story, was a very singular fighting force in Greece for two big reasons. One was it is one of two armies that we know about where it was made up of 300 soldiers, 150 same-sex male couples. So like what we would call bisexual, homosexual couples. And the idea was that if you also, more importantly, where you would be fighting next to your romantic partner. And the idea that was that if you're fighting next to your partner, you would A, fight harder to keep them alive, and B, fight harder to impress them, to kind of like show off, as like kind of like a courtship thing. But so this was very unique in ancient Greece, mostly because the way that same-sex relationships between men in other Greek cities didn't really facilitate this sort of relationship, because usually in other cities like Athens or Sparta, it would be between a soldier who was in his 20s and then a young man who's about to be a soldier in his late teens. And then when the young man became a soldier, he was expected to break up with the older soldier, and then go find a younger about to be soldier, to court and ideologically train as well. But so because of that, you would never have two soldiers who were also romantically involved fighting side by side. So that was one very big difference. The other big difference is that in this story, the Sacred Band was the only, I would say the only really professional army that we know about from ancient Greece, more so than even like Sparta, which put up a mirage that they were a professional army, but weren't really as much. So the Sacred Band of Thebes was created in mind to be a full year-round fighting force. And it was like part of the Thebans' taxes would go to supporting their barracks and feeding them and housing them. Whereas in other cities, it was always, their armies were more of what we would just call citizen militias. So, you would have your citizen soldier who would be farming most of the year or being a merchant. And then in the summer, they would fight. But whereas with Thebes, because of how they were created, they could fight all year round. And we have records of them fighting in the non-fighting season, i.e. any season that isn't the summer.
Well, that's really fascinating. Until reading your story, I didn't know anything about this type of warfare, and I mean, quite an interesting psychological motivation, I guess. That was definitely new to me. Ken, let's go back to you. And I asked Harrison about this and kind of the development of his story. You made a comment while we were emailing back and forth about, finally getting this out there. So, when did you start the story? What was the revision process like?
Well, I probably 2-3 years after after I started teaching. As I said, 3 of my friends were killed. It always stuck with me as to why that happened and not to me. What was it that asthma keeps me from going and sharing the dangers they have. And so it was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to do something to show it wasn't all in vain. And so I think when my son was born, my first child, it even struck home more. And I started putting things together in my head. But I was a teacher. I coached basketball, and so I didn't really have the time to put to it until I retired. But it kept ruminating in my brain. And once I retired, then I started putting these things down, and it was very emotional. So it really wasn't very good. So I had to accept the fact that you have to make it into something that an actual writer would do, with a good plot and dialogue and so forth. And it took me a while to work that out. And finally, when I moved to Ohio, I had a lot more time because I was retired from just about everything, and I was able to, I think, put the chapters in. I never did that until I realized it wasn't going anywhere. So I tried to show the 6 main emotions, or parts of warfare that affect the family, and I think that helped to bring it all together. So as far as how long did it take? Since 1967, that's how long it took.
And who was the first audience for this piece? Is it a family member? And what did they give you some good feedback?
Well, my daughter is in the military. She's a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. She read a lot of the final parts of it, and I also belong to a writers group here in Oberlin. And as I read the different parts, they gave me input as well. And some of them had been in the military, and so it was good to get their viewpoint, as well as from people who were not in the military. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's pretty much what I had to go through.
Yeah, it does. Congratulations on continuing to work on it, and hopefully a lot of people get to read it.
Well, thanks to your efforts, there's a good chance. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Bex, we talked a little bit already now about the elements of Papillon. I can't pronounce it.
Papillon. Yes.
Papillon Hall, and that it's related to the word butterfly. Do you know anything about, as I brought up the architecture, do you know anything about how it was built or why it was built to look like a butterfly?
I'm sorry. A finishing school? Papillon?
Yeah, why do you know about the architecture of the school as you were doing your research for the story?
Oh, so the finishing school that I mention in the preface to my story, it was called the Rodden House, and it was established in Hertfordshire, England, in 1840, and it was born out of the same very popular social discourse that was going on at the time, which was the woman question, as I mentioned earlier, and so the idea behind it was to instill in the women moral virtues and to become rulers of the domestic sphere, I guess you could say. I'm not aware of the architecture of the finishing school.
Well, I might have. I mean, I did find that online as I was just Google searching. So I might have misinterpreted that. I thought the hall that you wrote about in your story was specific to another hall that has that kind of architecture, but
Wow,
it might be a different one.
Actually, I think they might be different, but now I will go look that up and see what it's all about. But no, this one that I was referencing was just it was an old finishing school for young women that was established to create in them a more virtuous young ladies in the world, to help the world at large become more moral and virtuous. And it was just part of this conversation of how and why women's role should be to be these beacons of morality to the rest of the world. And the question that I wanted to pose is like, what happens to young women when they become all that they are hoped to be by other people, especially the religious institutions that they're a part of? And in my story, they disappear. They are no more. They become objects, just things to be looked upon, admired. But there's so much potential behind each of these women that was lost because of just, I guess you could say, the social structures that they were trying to fit themselves into. And that gives way to a lot of potential for spiritual and emotional abuse in those environments. So there's just a little commentary on that. But I'm curious about Papillon Hall in real life. I will look that up after this.
Well, I don't want to give away too much of the story for those who haven't read it, but as you said, she disappears. And you did touch on that women were subdued to a point that they lost some of their what they might have been capable of. So what did women do once they graduated from these finishing schools? Was it just on to marriage then next?
Yes, and the idea was so the woman who established this finishing school, her name was Sarah Stickney Ellis, and she was married to an evangelical minister in England. And she wrote in some of her texts that she had dreamed and envisioned of a formal institute for women where they could be educated to work in a domestic sphere, whereas the men would be educated to work in the public sphere where they belonged. The women would be educated to work in a domestic sphere. And morality and virtue was a very, very big part of that. And so in her text, she expressed that she hoped that this school, after they were trained and brought up to be as virtuous and as perfect, for lack of a better word, as they could possibly be, then they would be sent home. And the words that linger with me is that they would be sent home with this mantra of, what could I do to make my husband, my brothers, my father, and everybody around me as happy as possible. And while that sounds like a really nice sentiment, it also can be exploited, and often is, especially when there are controlling institutions that are capable of wielding that kind of power in somebody's life. So I was just kind of questioning that ideology of maybe it's not the best thing for women to just, or for these women in the past, but spiritual and emotional abuse is something that is very, very prevalent today, especially in very like legalistic religious societies, I guess you could say. And so what happens to them? That's the question.
Yeah, and it sounds like quite a burden too to be you're responsible for other people's happiness.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that was the thought, and the morality of the world at large, honestly. So, yes.
Well, I want to continue here with asking our panelists some questions, but I am looking to the Q&A. I don't see anyone that's posted a question, so please, if you want to ask a question for any of our panelists, just click on that box on the right-hand side with the question mark that says Q&A. Type your question in there, and I'll go ahead and direct that toward our panelists. Lori, so I suppose I have to admit that maybe I have some false perceptions about the Black Panthers. Really, the only thing I can point to in my education is Forrest Gump. Just seeing the Black Panthers in the film Forrest Gump.
Yeah.
So can you talk about and you did mention that the Black Panthers did have some missteps. So what do you want people to know about what this organization really represented?
Well, like so many things, there were good and bad. And they grew out of a real problem on the streets of Oakland, California in the late 60s, 1967, where the white police force was just brutal toward the residents of color, Black people. And at that time in California, it was legal to carry an armed firearm, a loaded firearm in public. So Huey Newton decided, along with Bobby Seale, that they were going to stand up for their community. And they took to whenever a brother or sister was pulled over or accosted and it looked like there might be something nefarious going on, the Panthers would show up with their loaded shotguns to confront the police. You know, nowadays that just would result in carnage, but it was legal at the time to do that. And Huey was a really self-taught guy. He had memorized large portions of the California Penal Code. And so he could stand there and face off against the cops and tell them every law they were breaking. And he did that, and it was actually quite a big success. And they made a big name for themselves in a very short period of time in the Bay Area. And then they grew. But they, you know, some of them, there was a lot of, they were not very nice to women, I will say, in their own organization. That's pretty well known. They could be violent and destructive. There's no doubt about that. But their core mission, which many of them did stick to, was to advance the lot of Black people, and they were not willing to do it the NAACP way, because that just wasn't working on the streets of Oakland, and it wasn't working in Detroit or Newark or any of the other cities that blew up back in like the summer of '68. And they saw a need to basically be very militant, and ultimately that was a no-go. The mighty force of the federal government basically wiped them out. It didn't hurt that, I mean, they didn't hurt their own cause by having some of the preeminent leaders commit some pretty terrible crimes, including the murder of a policeman. That was probably not going to stand them in good stead. So as I started off with, there was good and bad.
Well, I really admire the scene in your excerpt that Johnny is he's got a people are asking him about the 10-point plan or for the Black Panthers, and when you read it for face value, it's like, yikes, this is a lot.
It's totally revolutionary, and they were ready to bring down the white power structure with force if need be, and redistribute wealth and property. It's very radical. Absolutely.
Well, very radical, and certainly for 1968, but you look at it today, it's maybe less radical, but more like, how long does it take, before we get there? They were well ahead of their time, I guess I would say.
Well, and there's a line in the excerpt that you've published where one of the Panthers, I think it's Johnny, says to the group of white folks after he's been challenged, he says, 50 years from now, we cannot have white cops shooting Black boys in the back and getting away with it. And that was, 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's too bad, but it's an important reminder for us that weren't alive back then, that to be able to see that this continues, and that it's been a problem, and there's certainly a time we have to confront it.
I think that the whole thing is a cautionary tale. You asked, what did I learn about the Panthers? I would say it's a cautionary tale. You can interpret that.
Well, Harrison, I mentioned this in your story, that there are some violent scenes, but they don't feel gratuitous. Was that a skill you had to learn? How are you able to accomplish that as a writer?
Yeah, I don't really know. I think that, with the ancient world, especially when you think about like pop cultural depictions of it, maybe you'll think about the movie like 300 or the film Troy, where you have these very gratuitous, very glorified depictions of violence in the ancient world. And when it came to actually writing, I really just tried to put myself in the cultural headspace of a soldier in that period. And really that came from studying undergrad, like reading a lot of, the Greeks wrote a lot of war poetry, to put it lightly. And so there was a lot of literature that I had really encountered that really, I think, just kind of like fermented like what their perspectives of war was. But also I do want to mention that I had my senior year of college a really good professor who we were discussing the Battle of Cannae, which was this battle fought in, I think, the 200s against the Romans, against the the Carthaginians, and where the Carthaginians destroyed the Republican army basically to the man. And he, my professor was actually someone who I'd done archaeological dig on, and so he really understood like the physicality of the world. And I remember when we were reading the historical source described this battle, he was describing how like you have to imagine it's summer, Italy, it's hot. There you're in like heavy metal, just like cages, and you're using like these basically blunt swords to just like hack the person in front of you to death. And they were able to do this like to the nth degree. And I think when you approach, or when I approached writing my battle scenes, which were all actual battles that did take place, I just put myself in that headspace again. And when you try to encapsulate the reality, you really can't make it gratuitous because it is such a terrible and gruesome thing. But it's also something that these people, would do all the time, and they had very specific virtues and ideas about it. And so putting that all together, I think, so basically just taking it very seriously, allowed it to allowed sort of like the gratuity or the gratuitousness to kind of just wash away. I didn't want to write a Marvel action scene, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, like I said, it was really well done, and I think that's great advice. Great advice that you got from your professor, and thank you for sharing that for anyone who is writing. And yeah, you got to put yourself in the circumstances and in order to bring it to life. Ken, so as we sit here today, there are wars going on around the world, and so it's just a part of. I mean, anyone who researches history, it's just one war to the next. What do you think people can take away from your story, from this one soldier's perspective, about, I guess, what we can learn from the experience of soldiers going to war?
Well, I would hope that the people here in this country, especially, realize how important it is to have citizens who are willing to put their lives on the line for the country rather than go about making as much money as they can or getting a pole or hot car or things like that. And because right now, probably no more than 5% of our nation, 5% of the population in our nation has any experience with the military. And I don't just throw that number out. That's a survey, not actually a survey, but a count that the military has done, because it's so hard to get recruits. Today is a volunteer military. In Vietnam, there was a draft through most of the war, but today it's volunteer, and we depend on just a tiny group of our citizens to do this. And I think something which I have no control over has to be done for the country to realize how much they have involved here. Like a billionaire who's never been in the military, he depends on our military to defend his billions of dollars. And yet, in many cases, they might be minorities that he might not like or whatever. And, it really has nothing to do with it. What it has to do is, are you ready to support the people that you live with and around and that are citizens of this country? And so that's what I would hope comes out of this, that people realize the importance of putting their own lives on the line when it's necessary, instead of depending on somebody that, maybe barely got through high school, has a good brain, but came from a bad situation. It should be everybody, not just a couple.
Yeah, those are great reminders. I'm not sure what happened to Harrison, and hopefully he's able. There he is. Bex, I'm sorry. You said you are a service member.
Yes, that's right. I'm in the Air Force. I'm a first lieutenant in the Air Force.
Well, thank you for your service as well.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to wrap things up. I see we did get a couple questions, but we're nearing 8 o'clock here Central Time. So I'm going to wrap things up, but let's just go around one quick time. So Bex, let's start with you. Is there anything that you're working on that you want to highlight, and any final comments you might want to make?
Nothing in particular. I just posted a story on my blog. It's just a new story. But I did just want to make a comment, Mr. Bauer. I really enjoyed your story. It resonated with me in so many ways because of the military aspect of it and just some certain thoughts I've been going through. Just thinking about war at large. We're kind of in some times now, but I just really appreciated your story. And thank you for that. Other than that, thank you so much, Colin, for having me. It was a great opportunity.
Yeah, and I think you were referring to Burns. It was Ken Burns was that's okay. Chris Bauer wrote another story that's published in the member area, The Prophet. Lori, is it what do you want to highlight? Anything that you're working on?
I've got a new novel in the works, but I mainly wanted to say thank you, Colin. And I think this whole venture that you've got here is really terrific and giving writers a chance to share their work and also exposing readers to just so many different varieties of historical fiction. It's really terrific. Thank you.
Of course. Harrison, do you have any projects that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel as well right now, similarly set in ancient Greece, but this time I'm going to deal with the myths, so it's going way back. But besides that, no, nothing else really. But I did want to thank you so much for putting this together.
Yeah, and that's great that you're working on a full-length novel. Ken, so do you have any new stories that you're working on?
I have a couple novels that I've worked on the last couple of years. One set in 312 AD, which would be the Battle of the Milvian Bridge when Constantine came to power. And then I have another one that I have in fairly good shape about a young Scots boy in the 1700s, fisherman, who, because of his clan loyalties, he was to go into battle against the English, and his things that happened to him following the battle, not so much the battle itself, but following. And I'm still trying to write as much as I can. Try to do a lot of things before the candle burns out, But I really appreciate having this panel. I think all of you have contributed great stories for people to read, and Colin, very indebted to you for putting this all together.
Yeah, well, I want to thank our panelists. I'm so glad that you could join us for this special event. I want to thank everyone who attended. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. And if you haven't had a chance to read these stories, please do. Like I said, there's a button there on the bottom, join member area. It's just historythroughfiction.com/member-area. We are going to be publishing one new story a month. So we started off with 6, but we will publish one new story a month. So if you are a short story author, if you have a historical fiction novel and you want to publish an excerpt, send that to us. Check out our submission guidelines online, and we'd love to look at it. So thanks again, everyone. Have a fantastic evening.
Thank you.